The sun was melting into the Pacific when I stepped into the penthouse. From the balcony, I could see the water glowing gold, the air so still I could hear the faint hiss of the waves below. Inside, my mother was leaning over the stove, stirring a pot of soup. My father sat outside on the balcony wrapped in an old blanket, his head bowed low. Laughter came from the living room, my sister Amber's bright practiced laugh, and the deeper tone of her husband Kyle. I froze when I heard his words drift through the open sliding door. "We should tell our house guests, dinner's ready." The word hit like a slap. House guests. My father's spoon clattered against the bowl, trembling in his hand. My mother didn't speak. I tightened my grip on my purse, the leather creaking in my fingers, and for a long second, no one moved. Then I unzipped the bag, reached inside, and pulled out a folded envelope, the deed. The moment it touched the counter, the laughter stopped. Not a sound followed, only the wind from the balcony pushing through the curtains. 3 months earlier, I thought I had given my parents peace. I had spent years saving every cent, skipping vacations, late nights, calculating budgets in my tiny one-bedroom apartment in San Diego. When the realtor handed me the keys to a $675,000 penthouse overlooking La Jolla Cove, I thought it was the start of something beautiful. A gift not just of money, but of rest. For once, they wouldn't have to worry about rent or broken heaters or the smell of the old carpet in their worn-out duplex. I imagined my father drinking coffee while the morning fog rolled in, my mother humming by the kitchen window, sunlight on her hands. They'd earned this. Every dollar came from gratitude. I remember the day I wrapped the box that held the keys. I used cream paper and tied it with a gold ribbon, sliding a note beneath it. "For all the times you gave me more than you had." My mother loved little details like that. She used to tell me that the things we wrap with care hold more than gifts, they hold intention. I wanted this one to mean something beyond luxury. I wanted it to say, "You can stop fighting now." When I arrived that morning, she was watering her ferns in front of their old house, her hair still damp from the shower. "Eloise," she said, surprised. "Why aren't you at work?" I told her I'd taken the day off, that I had a surprise. My father came to the porch wearing the same plaid shirt he'd owned since I was a teenager, the sleeves faded from years of cooking and scrubbing dishes. He looked tired but proud, the way he always did when he saw me in my work clothes. I told them I wanted to take them somewhere, no questions asked. The car ride was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. When we pulled into the high-rise on Prospect Street, my father frowned. "Are we visiting someone?" he asked. "Not exactly," I said, smiling. I led them through the marble lobby, past the mirrored elevators, and up 23 floors. When the doors opened, the view took their breath away. The ocean stretched out like a living thing, sunlight dancing across the blue. My mother covered her mouth, whispering, "My God." I handed her the box. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said softly. She opened it with shaking fingers. The keys glimmered in her palm. For a moment, she didn't understand. Then she looked at me, tears pooling in her eyes. "No, Eloise, this can't be." My father just stared, jaw tight, eyes shining. "You bought this?" he asked. I nodded. "It's yours now, both of yours." He shook his head slowly, like he couldn't take it in. "We don't belong in a place like this," he whispered. "You do," I said. "You both do." I wish I could freeze that moment, the way my mother laughed through her tears, the way my father walked out to the balcony and lifted his hand to the sea breeze. For a brief second, the years of struggle and exhaustion seemed to melt away. They were light again, almost young. I thought the hard years were behind us. That evening, I invited Amber and Kyle to join the small celebration. My mother insisted. "We're family," she said. "She'll want to see." I hesitated, but I didn't want to dampen her happiness. When they arrived, Amber wore a bright red dress and a smile too wide to be genuine. Kyle, in his navy blazer and sunglasses, looked around like a man appraising a property. "Wow," he said, letting his hand slide along the marble countertop. "You really went all out." His voice held that familiar note of condescension, the kind that hides behind compliments. A penthouse in La Jolla must have set you back quite a bit. I smiled politely. It's not about the money, it's about them. He gave a small laugh. Sure. I just hope all the paperwork's clean. These high-end places can be tricky. My mother didn't notice the dig. She was too busy offering him a glass of champagne. Amber walked through each room as if she were hosting a showing. So this is the master suite, she asked, opening the double doors without waiting. Spacious. I followed her, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. It's for Mom and Dad, I said. You can stay in the guest room when you visit. She turned to me, tilting her head. Of course, she said, smiling. When we visit. Dinner was takeout from their favorite Italian place, served on the new china I'd bought for them. My father raised his glass. To our daughter, he said, voice unsteady. She gave us something we never thought we'd have. I tried to blink away the sting in my eyes. For the first time in a long while, I felt like a good daughter, like I'd finally done something worthy. Later that night, after everyone had left, I stood alone on the balcony, the city glittering below. My father's laughter still echoed faintly in my head. The ocean smelled like salt and promise. Behind me, I heard Amber's voice through the slightly open door, hushed but sharp. She never learns, she said to Kyle. She gives, we take. Kyle's low chuckle followed. Let her. It's easier that way. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The night breeze lifted the edge of the curtain, brushing against my arm like a warning. I wanted to believe I'd misheard, that they were joking, that my sister, my only sister, wouldn't say something so cruel. But something in her tone, that easy confidence, lodged itself deep inside me. It was the same tone she'd used when we were kids, and she'd taken my things and told me I didn't deserve them. I turned back toward the ocean, trying to let the sound of the waves drown it out. The keys glinted on the counter inside, catching the reflection of the moonlight. I remember thinking how beautiful they looked, bright, innocent, full of hope. I didn't know then that those same keys would one day rattle like chains. The morning of my mother's birthday began with the kind of light that made the ocean look endless. I woke before dawn, nerves buzzing through me like static. The air outside my window smelled faintly of salt and blooming jasmine, and for the first time in years I felt a strange, peaceful certainty. I was about to give my parents something that finally said, thank you. The silver keys sat inside a small wooden box on my kitchen table, wrapped in cream paper and tied with a thin gold ribbon. I'd run my thumb along the smooth edges so many times that the paper had softened. Beneath the bow, the note read, for all the times you gave me more than you had. I whispered the line aloud and smiled, hoping it would be enough. I'd spent nearly 6 years saving for that moment. Every extra shift, every canceled trip, every night I skipped dinner out with friends had led to this, a $675,000 penthouse overlooking La Jolla Cove. It wasn't just a property. It was freedom for two people who had spent their entire lives working for others. My father, Martin, once a Navy cook turned diner chef, had given up his dreams of owning a restaurant to pay our rent. My mother, Nora, had taught elementary school until arthritis made even holding chalk painful. They'd raised my sister Amber and me in a 2-bedroom apartment above his diner, the ceiling fan rattling louder than the conversations we never had about money. When I was little, my father would stand at our window after his shifts and say, one day I'll wake up and see the ocean from my bed. It became a quiet promise, one I carried long after he stopped saying it aloud. Now I was ready to give him that view. By mid-morning, I'd parked in front of their small stucco house, nerves twisting my stomach. My mother opened the door, still wearing her floral robe and glasses, her hair pinned loosely. Eloise, you're here early. Her voice was half surprise, half laughter. My father appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a towel. Is everything all right? I smiled. Better than all right. I need you both to come with me. No questions. They exchanged a wary look but followed. The drive along the coast was quiet except for the hum of traffic and the gulls circling overhead. My mother kept asking where we were going, and I kept saying, you'll see. When we pulled up to the high-rise, she frowned. Are we visiting someone? My father leaned forward, squinting at the marble facade. This looks expensive. We took the elevator up 23 floors. The doors opened to sunlight flooding through floor-to-ceiling windows. The ocean stretched beyond the glass like blue glass itself, alive and endless. My mother gasped. My father took a step back, eyes wide. "Whose place is this?" I handed my mother the box. "Yours." She stared, blinking, then slowly untied the ribbon. When she saw the keys, her hands trembled. "Eloise, no, you didn't." I laughed softly. "I did." My father said nothing, just looked around the room at the marble counters, the polished floors, the clean, empty air. "We can't live here," he said finally. "This is too much. It's not," I told him. "You've both earned it. It's time to stop worrying about bills and repairs and start enjoying life." For a long minute no one spoke. Then my mother touched his arm. "Martin, look at this view." She walked to the balcony and opened the sliding doors. The breeze caught her hair and lifted it like it remembered how to dance. "It feels like a dream." He joined her, resting one hand on her shoulder. His voice broke when he said, "You gave us more than we ever thought we'd have, sweetheart." We spent the afternoon exploring every inch of the penthouse. My mother measured walls with her hands, already planning curtains. "Something pale blue," she said, like breathing. My father found the perfect spot for his worn recliner by the window. For the first time in years, he looked rested. Around 5, the doorbell rang. My heart sank before I even opened it. Amber stood there in a crimson dress and too much perfume, Kyle beside her, in his designer blazer, sunglasses still on despite the fading light. "Surprise," Amber sang. "Mom said you had a big reveal today." Kyle gave a slow grin. "Wow, you really went all out. Fancy place for a family lunch." I forced a polite smile. "It's for Mom's birthday." Amber stepped inside without waiting. "Of course it is. You've always been the generous one." Her tone carried the same thin edge. It always had the kind that could slice while sounding sweet. Kyle wandered to the window, hands in his pockets. "A penthouse in La Jolla," he said, glancing around. "Must have cost a fortune." I hope the deeds clean. Real estate can be tricky these days. My mother, oblivious to the insult, hurried to pour them champagne. "Isn't it lovely Eloise did all this for us?" Amber smiled tightly. "So thoughtful. But don't you think it's a little extravagant?" I felt my jaw tighten. "It's a gift, not a showpiece." Kyle chuckled, swirling his glass. "Relax. I was just saying it's a lot to handle for 2 retirees. Managing property like this, the taxes, the maintenance, you sure you don't want some help with that?" My father frowned. "We can manage." But Amber was already circling the kitchen, her heels clicking against the marble. "It's just, big decisions like this can overwhelm Mom. Maybe it'd be good for me and Kyle to take a look at the paperwork, to make sure everything's in order." I said quietly, "It's already in order." She looked up, smiled, that careful smile that never reached her eyes. "Of course it is. Dinner was takeout from the Italian place my parents loved." We sat around the new dining table, the sunset painting everything in gold. My father raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice unsteady. "And to our daughter who gave us more than we ever dreamed." Amber clinked glasses, her ring catching the light like a small crown. "To family," she echoed. But her eyes met mine for a second, too long, the way a cat studies a bird it isn't ready to pounce on yet. Later, as they toured the bedrooms, I caught Kyle in the hallway studying the framed deed on the wall. His reflection in the glass looked pleased, not impressed. I remembered how his fingers lingered on the countertop earlier, tracing its edge as if testing ownership. When I walked him to the door, he said, "If you ever need help managing the place, you know where to find me." "I'll keep that in mind," I lied. After they left, my father settled into a chair by the window. "She means well," he said softly. "She means control," I replied. He sighed. "Gifts like this, they change people, Elle. You give them too much and they start to forget what's theirs." I didn't want to believe him, so I didn't answer. Instead, I walked onto the balcony and watched the water shimmer under the moonlight. Inside, my mother hummed as she unpacked dishes. I thought it was the sound of happiness. Maybe it was briefly. Just before leaving, Amber texted, "Dinner was wonderful. Kyle has some ideas about how to simplify things for mom and dad. We'll come by next week." I stared at the message, my reflection ghosting over the phone screen. Something in me tensed, though I couldn't say why. I told myself they just wanted to help. That family couldn't hurt what it loved. When I finally lay down that night, the ocean breeze drifted through the window, carrying faint echoes of laughter from the street below. I closed my eyes and tried to picture my parents waking up here every morning, smiling, safe, free. But somewhere between waking and sleep, a thought whispered through me, quiet. But sharp, peace never lasts long in this family. 3 weeks later, the penthouse didn't feel like my parents' home anymore. The walls that once echoed with their laughter had gone quiet, filled instead with the hollow rhythm of other people's lives. The pale blue curtains my mother dreamed of had been replaced with beige ones Amber called more modern. Kyle's golf clubs leaned in the corner near the balcony door, and a pile of children's toys his nephews apparently cluttered the living room floor. My father's old recliner was gone. So was the framed photo of my parents from their wedding day. When I arrived that Friday evening with a bag of groceries, I expected to smell my mother's cooking, maybe hear the TV humming with one of Dad's old game shows. Instead, the air smelled like vanilla air freshener and disinfectant. My mother opened the door, her eyes darting behind me as though she didn't want anyone to see I was there. "Oh, Elle," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You didn't have to come all this way." "I just wanted to bring dinner," I said, holding up the bag. "Your favorite lemon chicken from the market." Her smile faltered. "Amber already ordered something for the weekend. We have guests coming." Before I could ask who, Amber's voice floated in from the kitchen. "Is that my little sister? Don't just stand there, Mom. Let her in." Amber appeared, dressed in white like she'd just stepped out of a magazine spread. She gave me a quick hug that smelled of perfume and calculation. "We were just talking about you." "Really?" I said. "That's never good." She laughed, the sound brittle. "Don't be so sensitive. We were wondering when you'd stop by. Kyle was saying you must be so busy with work these days." Kyle walked in a moment later, still on a call, gesturing for silence like he owned the air around him. When he finally hung up, he smiled. "Eloise, always nice to see you." "Likewise," I said, forcing calm. "How's everyone settling in?" He looked around the penthouse as if inspecting his domain. "Pretty well, I'd say. Took a bit of organizing, but we've made it functional." Functional. That word burned. My mother started setting the table, her movements stiff and careful. My father sat outside on the balcony, staring at the water, his shoulders hunched, as though the view weighed him down instead of lifting him. Dinner was quiet at first. Kyle dominated the conversation with talk of investments and streamlining household finances. Amber nodded like she understood, though she mostly watched me, gauging my reactions. When I offered my mother some chicken, she shook her head. "Kyle doesn't want too much oil in the house," she said. "It clings to the air." I looked at her, confused. "It's your house, Mom." Kyle smiled without looking up from his plate. "We just want to keep things tidy. It's better for everyone." My father cleared his throat. "I like the smell of her cooking," he muttered. Amber shot him a sharp look. "Dad, please. You know how hard it is to get rid of kitchen smells in a place like this." I felt something inside me twist. My parents' home had turned into a stage and they'd been given minor roles. I watched my mother refill Kyle's glass without being asked, watched my father shrink into silence. After dinner, Kyle leaned back in his chair. "I've been helping your parents organize some of the property management stuff. The taxes, HOA fees, utilities. Just trying to simplify things for them." I frowned. "Simplify," Amber chimed in. "He's just making sure everything's handled properly. You know how complicated paperwork can get for them." "I'm sure," I said slowly. "Except there shouldn't be any paperwork. It's fully paid in trust." Kyle smiled like a teacher humoring a naive student. "Exactly. We're just keeping it that way." The air thickened. My father stood muttering something about checking the balcony lights, but I could tell he just wanted to escape. I followed him outside where the city lights shimmered on the glass railings. You okay? I asked. He rubbed his hands together. Kyle said we needed to sign some papers for utilities. Your mom thought it was fine. What papers? He hesitated. Just management stuff. Automatic transfers. He said it would make things easier. Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Did you actually read what you signed? He looked away ashamed. He said it was standard. And your mom was nervous. She just wanted to keep peace. The night breeze felt suddenly colder. I stared at the lights of the coastline, at the reflection of the penthouse glass splitting my father's face in two. Behind us, Amber's voice drifted through the door. You're making them anxious again, Elle. Can't you just let them enjoy their home? I turned to her. Is that what this is? Enjoying it. She crossed her arms, her smile razor sharp. You can't stand it when you're not in control. You bought the place, sure, but that doesn't mean it revolves around you. Control, I said, heat rising in my chest. You think this is about control? I gave them this place to rest, not to what? To worship you for it, she interrupted, stepping closer. You've always needed to be the savior. Maybe you should ask yourself why. Her words sliced cleanly deliberate. I almost replied, but my father stepped between us. Enough, he said quietly. Please, no more tonight. Amber gave him a soft, condescending pat on the shoulder. Of course, Dad. We don't want to upset you. Then to me she added, You should go. It's been a long day. I didn't move. My gaze drifted toward the kitchen counter, where a folder lay half open under a candle. I caught a glimpse of a document header, Property Administration Transfer Pending. My stomach dropped. Amber noticed my glance and moved quickly, closing the folder with a too casual hand. Kyle's working on some forms. Nothing important. I said nothing, but when she turned away, I snapped a quick photo with my phone. My pulse hammered as I tucked it back into my bag. My mother was in the laundry room folding towels that already looked clean. I leaned in the doorway. Mom, what's going on? Why are they managing anything? She didn't look up. Don't start tonight, sweetheart. It's just easier this way. Kyle knows what he's doing. Easier for who I whispered. Her hands trembled, the towel slipping from her grasp. Please don't make things harder. I wanted to scream. Instead, I picked up the towel and folded it for her slowly, neatly. She smiled weakly, a gesture of thanks or surrender, I couldn't tell which. When I finally stepped into the hallway, I heard Kyle's voice behind me, casual and cruel. Keep those keys somewhere safe, babe. I'll need them in the morning. The sound of metal jingling followed me out the door, sharp and steady, echoing down the corridor like a warning bell. I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The city blurred past lights streaking through my tears. In the rearview mirror, the high-rise shimmered against the night sky, beautiful, distant, untouchable. Inside that glittering tower, the family I'd tried to save was unraveling. And for the first time I realized the home I'd bought to bring peace might end up destroying everything left between us. The phone rang just as the first light touched the edge of my blinds. I almost didn't answer, still heavy with half sleep, but my mother's voice broke through, thin and shaking. Eloise, your father, he fell. I don't know what to do. By the time she said fell, I was already sitting up, one hand groping for my jeans on the chair. Is he hurt? Her breath caught on the other end. Just come. The drive to La Jolla felt longer than ever, though the streets were empty and the morning was clear. The radio was off. Every red light stretched eternity between heartbeats. I gripped the steering wheel so tight, the skin on my palms burned. Something in her voice hadn't sounded like panic. It had sounded like shame. When I reached the penthouse, the building looked too calm, too beautiful, glass, glittering balconies kissed by sunlight. The concierge gave me a wary look as I rushed past. Good morning, Miss Green, he said carefully, like he'd been told to use that tone. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and when I stepped inside the apartment, my breath caught. The place didn't look like my parents' home anymore. Boxes stacked in the corner bore labels in black marker: Amber Kids Room, Kyle Office, Redmond Family. The photo of my parents that once hung above the mantel was gone, replaced by a framed picture of Amber and Kyle on a beach in Florida, all smiles and false sunlight. The air smelled different, no trace of my mother's lavender candles, just the sharp bite of chemical air freshener trying to mask something sour underneath. And then I saw him. My father was outside on the balcony, sitting barefoot on a metal chair, his arms wrapped around himself like he was cold. His slippers were abandoned near the door. He looked smaller somehow, slumped and dazed. When I opened the sliding door, the breeze hit me with a chill that didn't belong to the California morning. "Dad," I said softly. He blinked up, trying to smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Don't worry, I'm fine. Just slipped." I crouched beside him, my heart twisting as I saw the bruise forming along his wrist. "You're not fine," I said. "It's nothing," he murmured, avoiding my eyes. The sliding door opened again behind me. Kyle stepped out, mug of coffee in hand, wearing my father's robe. His hair was perfect, his tone too casual. "Oh, you're here. We thought you were done with this place." I turned to face him. "What happened to him?" Kyle took a sip before answering. "He fell. It's fine. You really shouldn't panic about every little thing." I stood, my pulse pounding. "He's outside without shoes, freezing, and you're telling me not to panic." Amber appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "You're overreacting." He slipped. "Kyle was helping him up when Mom called you." "Helping him?" I shot back. "Or throwing him out?" Amber's mouth tightened. "You always make everything dramatic." I stepped past her into the living room. My mother was standing by the kitchen sink, clutching a chipped teacup. She looked pale, her eyes red and swollen. "Mom," I said, lowering my voice, "what's going on?" She didn't answer. Her fingers trembled as she tried to set the cup down, but the porcelain clinked too hard against the counter. My eyes landed on a stack of papers near the teapot, legal documents printed in color. At first glance, I thought they were bills until I saw the bold header, "Property Title Transfer." My stomach turned cold. I picked up the top sheet. My parents' names, Martin and Nora Green, had been crossed out neatly in pen. Beneath them in new type was written Amber Redmond. I looked up. "What is this?" Amber's tone was sharp. "Don't go through our things, our things." The words came out strangled. Kyle stepped closer, smirking faintly. "You gifted the place, didn't you? So technically it's theirs. And your mother decided it'd be easier to put it under one name for management purposes." I turned to my mother, my voice trembling. "Mom, did you sign this?" Her eyes filled instantly. "He said it was just for safety, that it wouldn't change anything." Kyle smiled like he'd been waiting for that. I explained everything to her. "You travel so much, Elle. We thought you wouldn't want to deal with maintenance or HOA board nonsense." "Mom," I whispered, ignoring him, "did you sign this?" She looked down at the cup in her hand. "He said you agreed. That it was still for us, just simpler." I felt the room tilt. "Simpler," I said quietly. "You handed her the home I bought for you." My father shuffled in from the balcony, still clutching his wrist. "Elle, no," I said, my voice shaking now. "No one signed anything without me knowing. Tell me you didn't." My mother's voice cracked. "I thought it was for peace." "For peace?" I laughed, hollow and bitter. "You think this is peace?" Amber's voice was flat, bored. "You're making a scene. This isn't about you." I turned on her. "You've turned my parents into guests in their own home." She rolled her eyes. "You're always the martyr. You give gifts with strings attached, and when people stop bowing, you cry betrayal." I took a step forward. "Say that again?" Kyle's voice cut through the air, calm and venomous. "You can always visit," he said, "but I think we've got it covered here." My mother moved, suddenly reaching for the kettle. "At least sit, Eloise. You must be tired." Her hands shook as she poured. Hot tea splashed across the papers, bleeding the ink, until names blurred and vanished together. No one moved. The smell of scalded paper filled the room. I picked up the wet document slowly, my voice low and steady. "This isn't over." Kyle leaned back in his chair, lifted his mug toward me like a toast. "You're right. It's just beginning." The air between us crackled with quiet hate. I didn't trust myself to speak again. Instead, I turned and walked out. The glass door slid shut behind me with a whisper, but the sound of keys dropping into the ceramic bowl by the door followed me like a ghost. By the time I reached my car, the sky had already darkened, clouds rolling over the horizon. I sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering column, staring up at the building that shimmered against the stormlight. Each window glowed like a lie. Inside those walls, my father's chair was gone. His slippers lay abandoned. My mother was still apologizing for things she didn't do, and the home I'd built to honor them had become a throne for the people who despised me most. I turned on the ignition but didn't drive. My eyes blurred not from tears, but from the raw disbelief that my own family could turn my gift into a weapon. When I finally pulled away, rain began to fall, dotting the windshield in uneven patterns. The city lights fractured through the water like broken glass. I told myself I'd find a way to fix this, but a small, ruthless part of me whispered that some things couldn't be undone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kyle sitting at the table with my father's mug, Amber's fingers tracing the marble countertop like it already belonged to her. I heard the sound of those keys clinking into the bowl, soft but final, a sound that said, "You've lost." But they were wrong. I hadn't lost yet. I'd just learned the rules of the game. The road home felt endless that night. Streetlights flickered past like slow blinks, and the hum of the engine was the only thing steady in a world that had cracked open beneath me. I drove without music, without thought, just the dull ache of betrayal throbbing behind my ribs. My mother's voice kept replaying in my head. He said it was for peace. I gripped the steering wheel until my palms ached. Peace. That word had never sounded so empty. When I reached my apartment, everything looked too clean, too untouched, as if the life I'd built there had nothing to do with the wreckage I'd just left behind. I dropped my keys on the counter, their clatter echoing in the silence. The city was still awake outside, but in my living room time had stopped. I filled the kettle, made tea I didn't want, and sat at the table staring at the steam curl upward until it vanished. For years, I'd believed silence meant control, that staying calm was strength. Now silence felt like complicity. My laptop sat open on the desk, a faint blue glow spilling across the floor. I pulled it closer, opened my emails, and started digging. If Kyle had forged paperwork, he'd left traces. People like him always did. It took less than an hour to find the first thread, a transfer receipt from the family account I'd set up years ago to pay my parents' utilities. The date matched the week before the supposed title update. The fee had been withdrawn, automatically signed and authorized by me. I stared at my own name on the screen, my stomach tightening. I hadn't logged into that account in months. Kyle had helped me once years ago when my father's health had worsened, and I'd needed to set up autopay for medical bills. I'd added him as a temporary admin, meaning he had access, and I'd never removed him. My throat went dry. He hadn't just stolen money, he'd used my trust like a crowbar. The room seemed to shrink around me. I opened more files, insurance renewals, maintenance invoices, authorization forms. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. Each transaction lined up perfectly with Kyle's timeline, every signature just slightly off from my real one, like a bad reflection. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Instead, I whispered to the empty room, "You used me." The next morning, I drove downtown to the property management office. The receptionist, a young man named Liam with dark circles under his eyes, greeted me with a polite but hesitant smile. "Can I help you? I need a copy of the ownership transfer for Unit 2304, I said. "It's urgent." He hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Are you one of the listed owners?" "I'm the one who bought it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something's wrong." Liam frowned, typed for a moment, then turned his screen slightly toward me. "Here's what we have." There it was. My mother's name, her real signature, and beneath it the witness line signed neatly, Kyle Redmond. My heart sank. "Who notarized this?" He scrolled further, eyebrows knitting. "It says it was verified electronically, but there's no video record." "That's unusual." "Can you print it for me?" I asked. He glanced around, then whispered, "I probably shouldn't, but something about that file felt off from the start." He pressed print, the hum of the machine filling the quiet. When he handed me the pages, his hand brushed mine. "Be careful," he said softly. Outside, the air smelled of salt and diesel from the nearby harbor. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the document, my own forged signature glaring back at me. I remembered my mother calling me months ago, asking for help renewing their car insurance. Kyle had been with her that day. I'd emailed her a digital lease agreement to use as ID verification. He must have saved that file, copied my signature, repurposed it for the deed transfer. I'd handed him the tool to rob me. By the time I reached my car, I could barely breathe. I set the printed papers on the passenger seat and just sat there staring at them, feeling the weight of what I'd lost. Not just money or property, but the simple faith that family meant safety. I'd given them a home and they'd turned it into a weapon. That night, I cleared the table in my apartment and spread out every document I had. The kitchen lamp cast a warm cone of light over the chaos: bank statements, copies of the trust deeds, screenshots of transactions. I drew columns on a yellow notepad: money flow, signatures, witnesses, motives. My handwriting shook, but I didn't stop. If they'd built their fraud on paperwork, I'd build my revenge the same way. My phone buzzed just after 9. A knock followed, soft, hesitant. I opened the door to find my father standing there, cap in hand, shoulders hunched. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since the day before. "Dad," I said, pulling him inside. "What are you doing here?" He glanced around nervously. "I can't stay long. He doesn't know I came." "Doesn't know," I repeated. "You mean Kyle?" He nodded. "He keeps track of where we go now. Said he doesn't want more drama." The way he said it, flat, defeated, made my stomach twist. "You have to get out of there. Both of you." He shook his head. "Your mother's scared. He told her, if she makes trouble, he'll move us to some other place far away. Somewhere she won't see you." "And you believe him?" I don't know what to believe anymore. He looked at me, eyes full of something worse than fear, regret. "I came to tell you, don't come back to the penthouse. Not yet." "Why?" He hesitated. "Because he's watching you too." The words hit me like cold water. How he said you'd ruin everything if you couldn't let go. He's got cameras everywhere now, even in the lobby. I swallowed hard. "Dad, listen to me. This isn't about letting go. He forged documents. He's stolen everything." "I know," my father said quietly. "And your mother knows. But we can't fight him like this. Not yet." He turned to leave, but I grabbed his hand. "You knew I'd never agree to this, didn't you?" "You knew." He didn't answer. He just pressed something into my palm, a crumpled receipt with 2 words scribbled in pencil: "Call MC." Then he walked out without looking back. For a long time I just stood there staring at the paper. The initials tugged at something in my memory: MC Marianne Cole, my father's old lawyer. She'd helped him years ago with his pension case. I hadn't spoken to her since. I sat down, the room spinning around me. He'd come to warn me, but he couldn't say it outright. The way his shoulders slumped, the way he looked over his shoulder before leaving, it wasn't fear of losing money. It was fear of losing freedom. I opened my laptop again and searched for her name. Her office still existed downtown, just a few blocks from the courthouse. As I stared at the address on the screen, something inside me steadied. The panic quieted, replaced by something colder, sharper. I gathered the papers from the table and stacked them neatly, sliding them into a folder labeled Restoration. The word felt right. I wasn't here to destroy anymore. I was here to rebuild what they'd tried to steal. When I finally turned off the lights, the city was still glowing outside my window, indifferent and alive. I stood there for a moment, watching the reflection of my face in the glass, tired, pale, but no longer helpless. They'd forged my name once. They'd taken my silence for weakness. Now I was going to write the ending myself. The cafe sat across from the courthouse, tucked between an old bookstore and a florist that smelled faintly of lilacs. The morning fog still clung to the windows, blurring the view of the street. I sat at a corner table nursing a cup of coffee gone cold, the crumpled receipt my father had given me resting on the table beside it. The words "Call MC" had nearly rubbed off from how many times I'd unfolded it. The door chimed. A woman in her 60s stepped in, silver hair, pinned back, her posture straight despite the weight of years. She scanned the room once and came toward me with quiet confidence. "Eloise Green," she said softly, as if confirming something she already knew. "Marianne Cole," I replied, rising to shake her hand. "You knew my father." "I did," she said, sitting down. "He told me once that if things ever went wrong, you'd come find me. I suppose that time has come." Her calmness unnerved me. "He left me a note," I said, sliding the folded page from his Bible across the table. "He trusted you." She opened it, her eyes moving quickly. "He was right to, and you were right to come." She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather folder worn at the edges. "I think he suspected this long before you did." Inside were photocopies of documents dated months before I'd bought the penthouse. Property trust papers bearing my name as primary guardian, signed and notarized, properly sealed by the county. "He set up a family trust?" I asked. Marianne nodded. "He wanted to ensure no one could ever transfer the property without your authorization. The irony is they never actually completed a legitimate transfer. The digital signature was cosmetic. The title never changed in the county database." I stared at her. "So the house is still mine legally, yes. Publicly, no. They've created enough noise to make you look guilty. But noise isn't law." The words sank in slowly, like sunlight breaking through fog. "Then what do I do?" Marianne sipped her tea unhurried. "We don't rush. We let them think they've won. You stay quiet. I'll trace the digital trail. If he forged your signature, there will be metadata, timestamps, missing verification files. The system always leaves ghosts." "Ghosts, traces people forget to erase," she said. "People forget, computers remember." By the time we left the cafe, the fog had lifted. The courthouse steps gleamed with dew. I followed her to her office 2 blocks away, a narrow space filled with old law books and the faint hum of a dusty desktop computer. She logged in, typing quickly, her glasses sliding down her nose. "There," she murmured, pointing to the screen. "This is the title record for the penthouse." Rows of digital entries appeared: file names, modification dates, verification logs. "See this," she said, highlighting a line labeled Redmond, Trust, Parent File. "It was uploaded and deleted within 24 hours. That's not standard." I leaned closer. "Can we recover it?" She smiled faintly. "Already did." When the file opened, my chest tightened. It wasn't just the fake deed. There were copies of my parents' IDs, my own digital signature, and a notary verification box left blank. "No video record," she muttered. "They used an auto-approve tool. Illegal, of course." Before I could ask more, my phone buzzed. "Unknown number." I hesitated. Marianne nodded. "Answer it." The voice on the other end was calm, older, precise. "If you keep digging, Miss Green, your parents will lose more than their home." I froze. "Who is this?" The line went dead. Marianne didn't flinch. "Good. That means we're close." That was a threat. "That was fear," she corrected. "And fear means they know we're coming." I exhaled shakily. "What now?" She folded her arms. "Now we find someone who's seen the truth from the inside." That afternoon, Marianne drove us to the penthouse building's parking garage. The air smelled of oil and rain, the concrete echoing with distant footsteps. Near the security booth, a man in a navy jacket stood waiting. He was tall, his beard peppered gray, his expression wary but kind. "Eloise," Marianne said, introducing him. "This is Hal Whitlow, the head of building security." I recognized him vaguely, the man who once helped my father carry groceries up to their floor. He gave me a small nod. "Your dad's a good man," he said. "Got me my job back when the company tried to cut my hours. I owe him." He looked around before lowering his voice. "I shouldn't be doing this, but you should see something." He slipped a small flash drive from his pocket, footage from a few days before the move-in. Boxes labeled as financial archives. They brought them in late at night. I checked the logs later. None of those boxes were supposed to exist. I hesitated before taking it. "Why are you helping me?" He smiled faintly. "Because good people don't deserve to be buried by bad ones." Marianne thanked him quietly. "You didn't see us." He nodded once and walked away. The drive burned like a secret in my pocket the entire way home. I plugged it into my laptop, half afraid of what I'd find. The footage played on a small split screen from the building's hallway cameras, timestamped 3 days before my father's birthday. There was Kyle unloading boxes from a truck. Amber followed, laughing at something he said. Each box was labeled in bold marker green holdings. My pulse quickened. They weren't supposed to use that name. That was the family trust account tied directly to me. In the video, Kyle crouched near the living room window, setting documents on the counter. His voice carried faintly through the camera audio. "If she ever checks, we'll just say it was Mom's decision." Amber's laughter followed, low-practiced, cruel. I paused the frame, zooming in. Kyle's hand hovered over the documents, a pen glinting between his fingers. That was the night they prepared everything. While I was planning a surprise birthday gift, they were planning a theft. The rage that rose in me wasn't wild this time. It was quiet, focused, sharp. Marianne's voice echoed in my memory. "We let them think they've won." I spent the next hours printing still frames, labeling timestamps, writing notes beside each illegal access, unauthorized signature, fraud, intent. My living room turned into a crime board, papers taped to the wall string, connecting names and dates like a web. By the time I stopped the clock, read nearly midnight. My eyes burned, but my hands were steady. I'd stopped shaking somewhere between frames 7 and 8. I sat at my desk, the flash drive beside my mug of untouched coffee, and opened a new folder on my laptop. I titled it Restoration and dragged every file inside. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of my computer. I stared at my reflection in the black screen, pale face, tired eyes, but something new behind them. Resolve. They'd wanted me quiet. They'd mistaken silence for surrender. Now silence would be my disguise. The next morning, I stood in front of my mirror, tying my hair back into a low knot. My phone buzzed with a text from Marianne. "When you're ready, don't confront him. Make him invite you." I slipped the flash drive into my purse, along with the photos, and a single note I wrote before leaving. "You can't rewrite what was never yours." Outside, the city was waking. The ocean shimmered in the distance, calm and endless, as if mocking the storm I was about to start. I locked the door behind me and walked toward my car. For the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. The building looked different in daylight, too bright, too clean, every window reflecting the ocean like a lie polished to perfection. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, keeping my head down. The security guard at the door gave me a polite nod, one that said he recognized me, but also knew better than to ask questions. I took the elevator alone, watching my reflection flicker on the mirrored walls. By the time the doors opened, my pulse had slowed. I wasn't here to fight. I just needed the truth. When I knocked, it took my mother nearly a full minute to answer. Her face was pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. For a moment, she looked like she might close the door again. "Eloise," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You shouldn't be here." "I came to talk," I said quietly. "That's all." The penthouse was silent, except for the faint hum of the dishwasher and the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the stove. The air smelled like cleaning spray and cold tea. I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me. She turned away, fussing with a towel on the counter. "He'll be back soon. I won't stay long." Her shoulders tightened, but she didn't turn around. "You don't understand what you're doing." I took a few steps closer. "Then, help me understand. Why did you sign those papers?" The towel slipped from her hands. For a long time she said nothing. Then her voice came cracked and small. He said if I didn't, he'd move your father somewhere else. A care facility. Far away. He said it was for his safety. My throat tightened. And you believed him. She finally turned. He said you'd already agreed. That you were leaving the country, that you didn't want to be involved anymore. He showed me a message, an email. I thought it was from you. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. He forged that too. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. I just wanted peace, Elle. I thought if I gave him what he wanted, he'd stop yelling. He'd stop making your father feel so small. The way she said small made my chest ache. I remembered my father on the balcony, shivering in his slippers, staring at the water like it belonged to someone else. I took her hand gently. He's using you, Mom. This isn't about peace. It's about control. She pulled away, shaking her head. You don't know what he's capable of. Yes, I do, I said, my voice steady now. But I also know what fear can do to good people. Her eyes flickered up to mine. I didn't mean to betray you. I know. That was when she broke. The tears came quietly running down her face as if she'd been holding them in for years. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't. Anger felt too heavy. What I saw wasn't a traitor. It was a woman cornered by her own hope. She sank into the chair at the kitchen table. He said it was temporary, she whispered. That once things settled, he'd change it back. But he didn't. He started bringing his own things, his own papers. I didn't know what to do. Why didn't you tell me? She looked down at her trembling hands. He checks my phone. He listens to my calls. Sometimes I think he even reads the mail. The words sent a chill through me. I glanced toward the hallway mirror and caught sight of my reflection, two women, one behind the other, both trapped in different kinds of silence. Mom, I said softly, we can end this. But I need your help. Is there anything left, anything Dad might have kept? She blinked through her tears, thinking. Your father. He didn't trust Kyle. Not really, he said once. If something happens, there's proof in the old house. I thought he was being paranoid, but maybe he knew. What proof? Her voice dropped to a whisper. In his study. Under the Bible. Before I could say more, the elevator dinged. The color drained from her face. He's back, she hissed. You have to go. Not without you. Please, she said, her eyes wide with terror. He can't see you here. Go through the back stairs. I hesitated, hearing the sound of keys jangling and Kyle's deep voice echoing from the hall. You're cleaning again. Didn't I tell you the maid comes tomorrow? My mother flinched. I backed away toward the side corridor. Through the reflection in the hallway mirror, I saw him toss his jacket on the couch, kiss Amber on the cheek, and walk toward the kitchen. You're making the place smell like bleach again, he said sharply. I was just tidying, my mother murmured. He laughed. You can't help yourself, can you? Always fixing what's not broken. I pressed my back against the wall, my pulse racing. My mother's eyes flicked toward where I stood hidden in the narrow hallway. For one breathless second, our gazes met in the mirror's reflection. She mouthed two words. Be careful. When he turned his back, I slipped toward the stairwell door, the handle cool beneath my shaking fingers. I waited until I heard him talking again, something about dinner plans, before I slipped out. The stairwell was dim and smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. My footsteps echoed softly as I descended, one hand gripping the railing. By the time I reached the lobby, my heartbeat had slowed, replaced by a heavy sadness. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade, painting the sky in streaks of coral and gray. I crossed the street to where I'd parked, but instead of driving away, I stood on the curb and looked back up at their balcony. My mother stood there now, small and still, her figure framed by the glass. When she saw me, she didn't wave. She just touched her heart, then turned away. I drove without knowing where I was going. The highway curved along the coastline, the ocean stretching beside me, relentless and calm. I thought about her words, about fear and silence and the things people do to survive. By the time I reached the edge of town, dusk had fallen. I pulled into the gravel driveway of the old house, the one they'd left behind. The yard was wild with weeds, the porch light broken. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and salt. I sat in the car for a moment, listening to the crickets before whispering, "You wanted me to find this, Dad. I will." The house loomed before me, quiet and patient waiting. As I stepped out of the car, a breeze carried the distant echo of the sea. I looked up at the cracked windows, the peeling paint, the faint outline of the study through the curtains. Somewhere in there the truth was waiting, buried under dust, under faith, under the weight of my family's silence. I reached for the keys in my bag and walked toward the door. The front door creaked open with a sound that made my chest tighten. The house smelled of old dust and rain-soaked wood, the kind of scent that clings to memory. I hadn't been here since my parents moved out, but everything looked exactly as we'd left it, except quieter, emptier, like time had stopped waiting for someone to come back. The curtains were drawn, and the late afternoon light filtered through in dusty streaks. I stepped inside my shoes, brushing across the thin layer of dirt on the floor. The walls still held faint outlines where pictures used to hang, family photos, graduation certificates, the framed wedding portrait my mother loved. The silence pressed against me. I made my way down the narrow hall toward my father's study, the same place where I used to find him late at night, reading old newspapers, a cup of coffee growing cold by his elbow. The door to the study stuck for a moment before giving way. Inside, the air was heavier, stale with disuse. His desk sat beneath the window, covered in papers yellowed by time. A few pens, a cracked photo frame, a Bible with worn edges. I ran my fingers over the familiar leather cover, tracing the grooves in the surface, until I found what I was looking for, a bulge in the back binding. I opened the Bible carefully, and something slid free, an envelope thick and sealed with tape gone brittle. My father's handwriting looped across the front in blue ink. For Eloise. My throat tightened. I tore the tape slowly and unfolded the pages inside. The first was a photocopy of a property trust dated months before the day I'd signed the final purchase. My name sat neatly under the title of primary guardian. He had listed himself and my mother as secondary trustees. It meant the home could never be sold or transferred without my authorization. It meant legally the penthouse had always been mine. The second page was a letter. "If you're reading this, it means I couldn't protect you from them. You always had a bigger heart than I did. You believe people mean well, even when they don't. Don't let that ruin you. Trust Marianne Cole. She knows what I couldn't finish." The handwriting grew shakier near the end. The ink smudged like he'd written it in a hurry. I pressed the page to my chest and closed my eyes. He'd known. He'd seen it coming and left me the map. When I opened my eyes again, the sun had begun to fade, and the study glowed with amber light. Dust drifted through the air like ghosts of all the words he'd left unsaid. I tucked the documents into my bag, grabbed the Bible, and headed for the door. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the porch. I stopped for a moment and looked back at the house, remembering the sound of his voice, the smell of coffee, the way he'd rest his hand on my shoulder whenever I doubted myself. For the first time in weeks, the ache inside me eased. He hadn't abandoned me. He'd prepared me. By the time I reached the city, the sky had turned deep indigo. The streets shimmered with reflected light, the air heavy with that sharp coastal chill that always came before rain. I parked near the courthouse again, just a few blocks from Marianne's office, and hurried up the steps. She was still there, her office lights glowing through the frosted glass. When she saw me at the door, she didn't ask questions, just gestured for me to come in. "You found something," she said. I set the envelope on her desk, still trembling. "He left this, the original trust papers. And a letter, he said to trust you." Her eyes softened, but her hands were steady as she pulled the documents from the envelope and began reading. The room filled with the quiet rustle of paper. "This deed predates the transfer Kyle submitted," she said after a moment, tapping the header. "That's big. And see here, your father listed you as the financial guardian. He created a safety clause that prevented secondary trustees from executing sales or transfers without direct approval. I leaned forward. So that means Marianne smiled small and knowing. That means what Kyle did was fraud. Cosmetic digital manipulation. It won't hold in court. My chest lifted with something that almost felt like hope. We can undo it. She leaned back, her expression sharp. We won't undo it. We'll let him undo himself. People like him can't resist bragging. You'll go back there, act remorseful, confused, small. Let him think you've surrendered. He'll expose his own hand when he tries to explain the paperwork to you. You want me to play along, I said slowly. Exactly. He thinks he's in control. Let him believe it. He'll tighten the rope himself. I nodded, my heart pounding. And then she said, we'll be waiting with proof. It sounded simple, but I knew it wasn't. I spent the rest of the evening in her office, rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd move, how I'd breathe. Marianne coached me through every line. Don't look at him too long, she said. He reads eyes. Keep your voice calm, soft, apologetic. He wants to believe you've broken. Let him. When I left her office, the city had gone quiet. The streets were slick with rain, and my reflection stared back from every puddle, steady, resolute, someone I barely recognized. Back home, I stood in front of my mirror and practiced. I adjusted my posture, softened my voice. I rehearsed the apology until it no longer felt like words but muscle memory. I just want peace, I said to my reflection over and over until it sounded real. The next morning I dressed carefully, no makeup, pale clothes, my hair pulled back. The outfit my mother used to say made me look gentle. When I looked in the mirror one last time, I almost believed the woman staring back was broken. I drove to the Penthouse just after noon. The sky was clear again, sunlight reflecting off the glass so brightly I had to squint. My palms were damp on the steering wheel, but my breathing stayed steady. When Kyle opened the door, his grin was the same one he'd worn the day he stole everything from me. Well, he said, leaning against the frame. Didn't expect to see you again so soon. I forced a nervous smile. I came to make peace. He stepped aside, clearly amused. Now that's a sentence I like hearing. The living room looked colder than I remembered. The walls were bare, the air too still. Amber was at the kitchen counter, pretending to scroll her phone but watching everything. I took a seat on the couch when Kyle gestured, folding my hands in my lap. I've been thinking. I began, keeping my tone soft. I might have overreacted. You were just trying to help, he smiled, sitting across from me. Exactly. Finally, someone's seeing reason. Amber snorted quietly, not looking up. Reason looks a lot like guilt. Kyle ignored her. Peace comes at a cost, Eloise. You gave them the house. Maybe next time you'll read the fine print. I looked down, letting my hair fall forward to hide the small recorder in my purse. You're right, I said softly. I should have trusted you, he chuckled. That's all I've ever wanted. The conversation dragged on, empty pleasantries wrapping around barbed truths. I let him talk, nodding at the right times, asking small, harmless questions. Every arrogant word, every self-satisfied smirk fed the recording, running quietly between us. When I left an hour later, he was still smiling. Glad we could clear the air, he said, hand on the door. Me too, I replied, stepping into the hallway. My voice was calm, but inside I was shaking, not with fear this time, but with purpose. Downstairs, I sat in my car and checked the recording. His voice played back clearly, the smugness unmistakable. I sent the file to Marianne with one text, got it. The ocean shimmered beyond the glass buildings, endless and blue. For the first time in months, it didn't look like distance. It looked like direction. Dinner at the Penthouse felt like walking into a theater where everyone already knew their lines but me. The table was set perfectly, white linens, polished silver candles burning low enough to make everything shimmer. Amber greeted me at the door, her smile stretched tight like it had been pinned in place. Kyle followed behind her, sleeves rolled up, wine glass in hand. Look who decided to join us, he said, voice smooth as ever. I thought we could all use a calm evening, I replied, holding my bag close. Inside it, the small recorder was already running. Amber's tone was clipped. We're glad you're trying to move forward. I'm just tired of the tension, I said softly, letting my shoulders slump. It's exhausting. Kyle grinned, clearly pleased. Finally, someone's being reasonable. They led me to the dining table where my parents were already seated. My mother looked at me with a flicker of worry that she tried to hide. My father avoided my eyes altogether. I took a seat beside them and reached for the napkin in front of me. My fingers trembled, but I told myself it wasn't fear, it was control disguised as weakness. For the first few minutes, everything felt almost normal. Amber asked about work, Kyle poured wine, my mother made small comments about the food. But under the laughter there was a strain, a stiffness that never broke. Kyle leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass. You know I have to hand it to you, Eloise. Most people wouldn't be this mature after such a mess. Shows you've learned to trust again. Trust, I repeated. That's a good word. He smiled. Exactly. We're all family, right? We can't keep dragging up the past. I looked around the room, the marble counters gleaming behind him, the expensive art he'd hung on the walls. You've made the place look different, I said. Amber shrugged. We thought it needed a touch of warmth. It was a bit sterile before. I liked it the way it was, I murmured, just loud enough for Kyle to hear. He ignored that. Instead, he launched into a speech about property value and future investments. He used phrases like long-term sustainability and restructuring assets, pretending he was doing my parents a favor. I nodded politely, every movement rehearsed. At one point he said, managing property like this isn't easy, but luckily we streamlined everything. Once the deed's secure, the rest is just paperwork. My pulse quickened. The deed, I asked lightly. You mean the transfer? Amber shot him a warning look, but he was too comfortable, too sure of himself. Of course, he said, waving a hand. You don't think your parents are handling all that on their own, do you? I smiled faintly. No, I suppose not. You're good with details, he chuckled. Exactly. That's why I handle the signatures and verifications. You'd be amazed how many people forget to file correctly. Thankfully, your mom's old signature file made things easy. Her old signature file, I repeated, feigning confusion. Digital paperwork, you know. Most people don't even realize how simple it is. Once you've got the template, everything else is just copy and paste. Amber's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Kyle, she warned under her breath. He grinned, oblivious. Relax, babe. We're just talking. I tilted my head, playing the innocent. You mean, you reused her signature? He laughed. Don't sound so shocked. It's not like she reads half of what she signs anyway. That's why I do it for her. The words hung in the air. My mother's hand went still on the table. My father looked up, eyes suddenly clear and furious. Amber shifted uncomfortably, pretending to drink her wine. I leaned forward, keeping my tone gentle. That's impressive, Kyle. You must really trust yourself to handle everything. Someone has to, he said smugly. If I didn't, this family would drown in paperwork. I smiled, though it felt like fire behind my teeth. You're right. You've done so much. He smirked, misreading the tone completely. Finally, some appreciation. The rest of the meal blurred into a mix of forced laughter and wine. Every time he bragged, I stored his words like ammunition. The recorder caught it all, the arrogance, the admissions, the tone that said he thought he was untouchable. Halfway through dessert, Amber snapped. You don't have to gloat, Kyle. He glanced at her, amused. I'm not gloating. I'm being honest. Honest, she repeated, her voice sharp. You think taking over someone else's home and lying about it is honest? He set his fork down slowly. You were fine with it when it meant living here. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My mother pushed her plate away. My father stood abruptly and walked to the balcony. I broke the tension by standing too. Thank you for dinner, I should go. Kyle looked smug again. Leaving so soon, we were just starting to enjoy ourselves. I've enjoyed enough, I said. I walked toward the door, pausing only long enough to glance at the table. My mother met my eyes for the first time that night. Her lips moved, barely forming words. Be patient. I nodded and left without another word. In the hallway, the air felt cooler, sharper. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the faint thrum of my heartbeat beneath my ribs. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped inside, exhaling for what felt like the first time all evening. Once I reached the car, I sat for a long moment before pulling the recorder from my bag. I hit play, and his voice filled the small space. Once the deed's secure, the rest is just paperwork. Your mom's old signature file made things easy. It's not like she reads half of what she signs. Every word was crystal clear, his arrogance perfectly preserved. I forwarded the file to Marianne with one line, he confessed. Her reply came a few minutes later. Good. Don't engage. Tomorrow everything changes. I turned off the engine and looked up at the building towering above me. Through the tall windows I could see faint movement shadows crossing the light. Amber pacing Kyle, gesturing my mother standing still as stone. The city lights glimmered beyond them, indifferent and endless. I whispered into the quiet, You think you've won, Kyle, but this is just the beginning. The night breeze moved through the car, carrying the faint hum of traffic and the salt of the nearby sea. I sat there calm, now steady. The fear that had once tangled around my throat was gone. In its place was something sharper, quieter. By the time I drove away, I wasn't shaking anymore. I was smiling. The morning after dinner began like any other, the sky washed in pale gold, the city yawning awake. I made coffee, leaned against the counter, and listened to the silence. For the first time in weeks, it didn't feel suffocating. I had proof now. I'd heard him confess, his arrogance caught word for word. Marianne's message still glowed on my phone. Don't engage. Tomorrow everything changes. I should have felt relief, but instead, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that comes before a storm. The first sign of it came at 8:17 a.m. My phone buzzed, lighting up with dozens of notifications. I frowned, assuming it was Marianne again. Then I saw the name at the top of the screen. Amber Redmond has tagged you in a post. My blood went cold. The photo showed me standing beside my father at the Penthouse weeks ago, the day I handed over the keys. I was smiling, holding the small gift box. The caption read, Heartbreaking truth, my sister manipulated our elderly parents into signing away their home. Please pray for them. I scrolled down. Hundreds of comments flooded beneath. How could she do that, greedy witch? Poor parents, they looked terrified. Every word burned like acid. By the time I hit the end, the post had already been shared over 300 times. My stomach turned. I tried to call my mother. No answer. I called my father straight to voicemail. The third time, the call didn't even ring. Then, another notification appeared. Kyle Redmond posted a video. My hand shook as I tapped it. It was a slideshow of photos. My parents looking tired, sitting on the couch, my mother, with red eyes as if she'd been crying. Over it, Kyle's voice narrated smoothly, full of feigned sorrow. When your own child betrays you, there's no easy way to heal. But love forgives. We just hope she finds peace. The ending showed him standing by the balcony, holding the house keys. The caption read, Family should mean home. We'll protect what's ours. I stared at the screen until my reflection blurred against the glass. He hadn't just stolen my parents, he'd stolen the narrative. The doorbell rang sharp and sudden. For a moment I thought it was them, but it was only a delivery boy holding an envelope. For Miss Green, he said, offering a polite nod. The envelope was plain, no return address. Inside was a printed screenshot of the post with one handwritten line beneath, Silence won't save you. The letters looked like they'd been written with the same expensive pen Kyle always carried. I sank into a chair, pressing my hands to my temples. The walls seemed to tilt. My name was trending now on local forums, gossip pages, even neighborhood threads. Strangers debated my character, as if they'd lived my life. Someone had found my company website and left comments about elder abuse and fraud. Clients began pulling their projects one after another. The noise was unbearable, 100 voices accusing, none of them knowing the truth. I typed a post, half defense, half plea, but deleted it before sending. Marianne's warning echoed in my mind. They want you loud. Don't fight noise with noise. By noon, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Every vibration felt like a tremor through my spine. I turned it off and sat on the floor, knees drawn up, listening to the muffled hum of the refrigerator. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The humiliation had moved past pain. It felt hollow now, like standing in a room that had already burned down. The quiet didn't last. My laptop pinged with an incoming email. The subject line read Family Matters. From Kyle. The message was short. You brought this on yourself. Maybe next time you'll think before embarrassing us publicly. Attached was a photo of my parents sitting at the dining table, both looking down. In the background, I could see Amber's hand on my mother's shoulder. The caption under the image read, "Peace at last." The cruelty of it made my chest ache. He'd turned them into props, smiling victims in his story. By 3 o'clock, Marianne called. Her voice was steady, calm as stone. I saw the post. Do not respond. They're destroying me, I said. They're trying to. That's their last move. It means they're scared. Scared, I almost laughed. They look untouchable. Reputation isn't law, she said. I've already filed with the county. The documents your father left have been verified. Their so-called transfer doesn't exist legally. Tomorrow we serve them papers. Tonight you stay quiet. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. What about my parents? They're being manipulated, she said softly. You can't pull them out yet. But you can free them once this is over. After we hung up, the apartment felt too still. The hum of the city outside seemed far away, like the world had retreated. I made tea out of habit and watched the steam rise until it disappeared. When I closed my eyes, I saw the penthouse, the marble floors, the light, my mother's face when she said, I just wanted peace. It was almost sunset when another notification appeared. A new video posted by Amber this time. I opened it with shaking hands. It was filmed in the living room of the penthouse. My parents sat at the table, Kyle beside them. My mother's hands were clasped, trembling slightly. My father stared at his lap. Amber's voice narrated this time. Sometimes love means forgiving even when it hurts. Our family has been through so much, but we're moving forward. At the end, Kyle raised a glass. To family. The camera panned briefly to my mother. Her eyes flicked toward the lens, and for a fraction of a second I saw it, the silent plea, the same one from the balcony weeks ago. Then she smiled small and practiced. I closed the video. My reflection stared back at me in the black screen, tired, hollow-eyed, but alive. My humiliation had reached the world, but my anger had found direction. I walked to my desk and opened the folder labeled Restoration. Inside were the files, the recording of Kyle's confession, the time-stamped footage from the security cameras, the trust deed my father had hidden. I spread them out one by one, tracing the lines of ink, the signatures, the legal seals. You think this story belongs to you, I whispered. You have no idea who's been writing the ending. I worked until nightfall, sorting evidence, labeling dates, cross-referencing every document. When I finally stopped, the city was dark, rain tapping softly against the windows. My phone buzzed once more, a message from an unknown number. Stay quiet tomorrow. He's watching. There was no signature, but I recognized the handwriting. Maria, the doorman. I typed back a single line. Thank you. Outside, lightning flashed far out over the ocean, white and silent. I stood at the window watching the glow fade. They wanted me humiliated, erased. But humiliation doesn't kill you. It teaches you how to stand. Tomorrow, the noise would turn against them. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, the documents still spread out on the table. The sound of rain filled the room like a steady heartbeat. Peace, I murmured, comes after the fire. The summons arrived just before sunset. Marianne called while I was staring out the window, watching the ocean blur into gold. Her voice was steady, measured, like she'd been waiting for this moment longer than I had. It's time, she said. We're serving the documents tonight. I didn't hesitate. The folder I'd kept on my desk for weeks was already packed, the original trust deed, Kyle's recorded confession, the notarized verification from the county office. Proof. I slid it into my bag, zipped it shut, and took one last look around my apartment. It felt small but safe, mine, untouched. I whispered to the quiet, "Let's finish this," and walked out. The air outside carried a chill, the kind that usually came before rain. The city lights blinked to life one by one as I drove downtown, the hum of traffic steady beneath the rhythm of my heartbeat. When I pulled into the Penthouse garage, Marianne was already there, leaning against her car in a gray coat, briefcase in hand. She gave me a look that wasn't quite a smile, but close enough. "Ready? I've been ready since the day he took the keys." We entered the lobby together. The security guard, Maria, looked up from her desk, her face pale. She didn't say a word, only gave me a small knowing nod. The elevator ride was silent, except for the sound of our breathing. As the doors slid open on the 23rd floor, I felt the familiar tension wrap around my chest, but this time I wasn't afraid. Kyle opened the door before I could knock, like he'd been expecting me. He wore his usual smug grin and a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Back again. You really should learn when to quit." Behind him, Amber stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, her expression tight. My parents were seated on the sofa. My mother's eyes darted between us. My father's hands gripped his knees. Marianne stepped forward, her tone crisp. "Mr. Redmond, I'm here on behalf of Miss Green. I'm serving you official notice of property reinstatement under the Green Trust, effective immediately." Kyle blinked, the grin faltering. "I'm sorry." What she handed him, a sealed envelope stamped with the county seal. "This property was never legally transferred. The signatures you submitted were falsified. The deed remains under Miss Green's guardianship." His jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous." Marianne smiled faintly. "Then you won't mind if we confirm it in court?" Amber moved closer, her face paling. "Kyle, what is she talking about?" He ignored her, tearing the envelope open and skimming the first page. His fingers twitched around the paper. "This means nothing," he snapped. "You can't just show up here waving documents and think it changes," I interrupted, my voice calm. "Actually, you already changed everything." He looked up sharply and I pressed play on my phone. His own voice filled the room, rich with arrogance. "Your mom's old signature file made things easy. Once the deed's secure, the rest is just paperwork." The sound seemed to freeze the air. My mother gasped, her hand covering her mouth. My father rose from the sofa, his shoulders squared. Kyle's face drained of color. What I said. "Recorded you. Watched you brag about stealing from my parents. You made this easy." Marianne handed another copy of the transcript to the uniformed officer who had entered behind us quietly, a city investigator who had been waiting in the hallway. "This is corroborated evidence of digital forgery and coercion," she said. Amber stumbled backward, eyes wide. "Kyle, tell me this isn't real." He turned on her. "You think I did all this alone? You were part of it." She flinched. "I didn't sign anything." "No," I said softly. "You just watched him do it." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting. My mother began to cry quietly. My father walked toward me, each step slow but sure. "Enough," he said, his voice low but firm. "This ends now." For a moment, even Kyle couldn't speak. Then he laughed, short and sharp. "You think a few papers and a recording will save you? You have no idea how business works." "Maybe not," I said. "But I know how law works." Marianne gestured to the officer. "You'll want to review these documents. The fraud division's already received copies." Kyle's smirk vanished. He started to speak, but no words came out. His confidence cracked like glass. Amber backed away toward the wall. "You told me it was legal," she whispered. "I told you what you wanted to hear," he snapped. My father turned to him, his voice steady. "You've taken enough from us. Get out." Kyle laughed again, but it sounded hollow now. "You think this little paper changes anything? You think this house, this family is yours now?" "No," I said quietly, stepping forward. "But this does." I held up the keys, the same ones I had given my father months ago, now resting cold in my palm. The metal glinted under the lights. He stared at them like they were poison. "You think you've won?" I shook my head. "Winning isn't the point. Ending this is." Behind me, Marianne nodded to the officer. He stepped forward, taking the envelope from Kyle's trembling hand. "Mr. Redmond, you're required to vacate the premises until this case is reviewed. You'll be contacted by the county's legal office within 72 hours. Kyle turned red. "This is my home, no," I said softly. "It never was." My mother stood then, her face streaked with tears. "You used our fear," she said, her voice shaking. "But you'll never use our silence again." Kyle opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked smaller somehow, standing there in the place he'd tried to own, surrounded by everything he'd stolen and now couldn't keep. Amber sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. My father put an arm around my mother, steadying her. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I took one last look at the space, the marble counters, the polished floor, the faint reflection of the city lights through the glass. It had once been a dream. Now it was just a crime scene dressed as a home. I set the keys down on the entry table, not as a victory, but as closure. This place was supposed to bring peace, I said. Maybe now it finally can. Marianne touched my arm lightly. "We're done here." We walked to the door together. As it clicked shut behind us, I heard my father's voice, soft but certain. "You did what I couldn't." In the hallway, the air felt cooler, lighter. Marianne handed me a small folder, the official reinstatement stamped with my name. "It's over," she said. I looked down at the document, the bold black letters spelling out Green Trust Primary Guardian Eloise Green. For a long moment, I didn't speak. The hum of the elevator filled the silence. Finally, I said, "Not yet. There's still one thing left I need to do." Marianne smiled faintly. "Then do it. But tonight rest. You've earned it." We stepped out onto the street. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement, the ocean breeze carrying the faint scent of salt and jasmine. Behind us, the Penthouse tower stood still, its windows glowing like a fading memory. I looked up once more, the reflection of light catching on the glass. "It's not about revenge anymore," I whispered. "It's about taking back what's real." Marianne turned to me. "You already have." We walked toward the cars, our footsteps echoing softly against the concrete. The night felt clean, almost gentle. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of someone else's shadow pressing against my lungs. Justice wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and final. And it had finally found its way home. 2 weeks later, the city felt different, quieter, softer, as if the noise that had once swallowed me had finally burned itself out. The air smelled of salt and warmth, the first signs of summer creeping in. I walked along the coast with my shoes in hand, the sand cool under my feet. For the first time in months, my chest didn't feel tight. The storm had passed. The court had accepted the documents. The penthouse, once a weapon, now stood empty and still. Kyle's name had disappeared from every record. The fraud investigation was underway, and for once I didn't need to watch it unfold. Justice didn't need witnesses. It worked quietly, the same way the tide erased footprints. Amber was gone, too vanished from social media, from the whispers of town. I didn't hate her. I just couldn't carry her anymore. That morning, I held a small wooden box in my hands, the same one that once held the keys. Inside it, wrapped in linen, were two things: my father's old Bible and my mother's teacup repaired with thin seams of gold running through the cracks. I drove to the penthouse for the last time, the car humming softly beneath me. When I stepped inside, the air felt lighter than I remembered. Sunlight spilled across the marble floors, catching the faint dust in the air. Everything echoed now, the quiet, the calm, the end of something that had once been loud and cruel. I set the box on the kitchen counter and walked through each room slowly. The living room where I'd once found them laughing. The balcony where my father had sat barefoot in the cold. The hallway where I'd first heard the truth unravel. Every space held a piece of me, of us, but none of it hurt anymore. I took the Bible and the teacup upstairs to the rooftop garden. The city stretched wide below the ocean, shimmering like liquid glass. The breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine, my mother's favorite. I placed the Bible on the stone table and set the teacup beside it. It glinted in the sunlight, the cracks glowing gold. "This place was supposed to bring peace," I whispered. "Maybe now it finally can." I didn't stay long. Some places don't need goodbyes, they just need release. The next morning I met my father at a park near the coast. He was already there, sitting on a bench beneath the old oak tree, a cane resting against his knee. He stood when he saw me, slow but steady, his face more relaxed than I'd seen in years. "Still too stubborn to ask for help," I said, smiling. He chuckled, still too proud to accept it. We walked together around the fountain, not saying much at first. The air was full of the smell of fresh grass and sea breeze. "Your mother's painting again," he said finally. "She started seeing a counselor. It's helping." I nodded, my throat tightening. "Good. She deserves that." He glanced at me. "We all do." We sat down again, watching the water ripple. For a while the world was silent except for the sound of birds and the gentle splash of the fountain. Then he said quietly, "You didn't just get the house back, Elle. You broke the cycle. You gave us our voice again." I looked at him, sunlight touching the lines of his face, softening them. "You gave me mine first." He smiled, and for the first time the weight between us lifted. That night, after he'd gone home, I received a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me open it. It was from Amber. I didn't know what he was capable of. "I'm sorry." I typed 3 different replies, deleted each one, then finally turned off the phone. Some apologies don't need answers. Some doors once closed are meant to stay that way. A week later, I sat across from Marianne in her office. The paperwork was ready, a small stack of forms neatly arranged on the desk between us. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "I am," I said. "It's time to build something that lasts." She handed me a pen, and I signed my name at the bottom of the page, the Quiet Line Fund. A foundation for women rebuilding after family betrayal or financial abuse. Marianne smiled. "You've turned pain into purpose." I looked at my signature, the ink still drying. "No," I said softly. "I've turned silence into something that speaks." When I left her office, the afternoon sun hit the glass buildings just right, scattering light across the street like gold dust. My new apartment was smaller, simpler, but it felt alive. The windows opened wide to the breeze, the walls warm with light. I unpacked the last of my boxes that evening. On my desk, I placed a framed photo, my parents from years ago, smiling in front of the diner where they'd worked half their lives. They looked happy, tired, but real. Beside it, I set the teacup. The cracks caught the light, glowing faintly in the setting. Sunday, I poured coffee into it the way my mother used to every morning and carried it to the window. The ocean stretched beyond the skyline, endless, forgiving. "They say forgiveness sets you free," I murmured. "Maybe it does. But for me, freedom began the moment I stopped waiting for them to understand and started understanding myself. I didn't need the penthouse. I didn't need a monument to love that never knew how to stay. I just needed to live, to keep building a life that didn't ask for permission to exist." Outside, the sky deepened to twilight. Lights flickered on across the city, one by one, like quiet stars. I thought of my mother painting again, my father tending to his small garden, their laughter finding its way back through the cracks of everything we'd lost. The world didn't end with betrayal, it began with what came after. On the rooftop of the penthouse, the Bible and the teacup would remain. I didn't take them back. I wanted the next owners to find them one day, to wonder why they were left there together. Maybe they'd understand that faith and broken things can live side by side. And maybe they'd learn, as I did, that peace isn't something you buy. It's something you rebuild, piece by piece, with both hands shaking and steady. If you've ever lost something you built out of love, a home, a dream, a part of yourself, I hope my story reminds you that what's taken from you doesn't define you. What you rebuild does. Tell me, have you ever had to start over after being betrayed by someone you trusted? Share your story in the comments. Your words might help someone else heal. And if this story touched you, stay with us. There are more stories waiting, more voices finding their way back to peace. Because in the end, peace always finds its way home.